The United States Constitution mandated a federal census to provide essential data for determining representation, fund distributions, and policy decisions. The inaugural census was in 1790, and it has been taken every 10 years since. The information on the censuses becomes public 72 years after they were originally taken, making them an invaluable genealogical resource for tracing ancestors and their families through time. The available censuses will be used as a backdrop to detail the journeys of the American presidents, exploring who was alive, where they were, and what they were doing, all while tracing the expansion of America over time. The first census day was August 2, 1790. The information provided to officials, regardless of when it was given, was to be a snapshot of that specific day. 11 current and future presidents were alive on this census day. 4 of them were serving in the federal government, whose capital was in New York City. While there, they temporarily resided across the city, and government sessions took place at Federal Hall. Despite them temporarily living in New York, the census instructions required individuals to be recorded at their usual place of abode to ensure proper representation counts. The 1790 to 1840 censuses only provided the names of heads of families, an account of individuals living in their household, broken down by age, gender, race, and status, making it hard to identify individuals with a high level of certainty. Furthermore, many census records from this period were lost or destroyed, but fortunately, the presidents have a ton of other research materials to rely on to provide reasonably accurate conclusions of their situations at the time of the census. The states and territories that took part in the 1790 census had a total count of almost 4 million people, of which 17.8% were slaves. The most populous state at the time was Virginia, whose residents included 6 of the 11 presidents. The counts for Virginia survived, but all of the individual census entry pages were lost or destroyed. The nation's first and current president, George Washington, was 58 years old. He was living at his Mount Vernon plantation, which encompassed nearly 8,000 acres and whose major cash crop at the time was wheat. Washington would have been listed as the head of household, and his wife, Martha, would fall under the free white females column. George and Martha did not have any biological children, and all of Martha's children from her first marriage had passed away. However, 2 of her grandchildren, Eleanor and George Parke Custis, were residing with them as well. The property was home to hundreds of slaves, free workers, and more distant relatives who would also be included in the census entry for Washington. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison Jr., and James Monroe were all living within 21 miles of each other further inland. Jefferson was at his Monticello plantation, Madison was at his father's Montpelier property, and Monroe was living in Charlottesville. Jefferson was Washington's Secretary of State. His wife, Martha, and 4 of their 6 children had already passed away by 1790. His oldest daughter married earlier in the year and was no longer on the plantation. This left his daughter, Polly, as the only immediate family member that would be on the census with him, as well as the hundreds of slaves and free workers on the property, which included a young Sally Hemings. 39-year-old Madison was living with his parents and potentially up to 6 of his living siblings. His father, James Sr., would have likely been listed as the head of the family since he owned the property. There were also many slaves and free workers who would be listed in their census entry. Madison was serving in the House of Representatives and was single without children. Monroe was a lawyer who was married with a young daughter named Elizabeth. Later in the year, he would be elected as the replacement senator for the late William Grayson. Grayson defeated James Madison for that Senate seat, which prompted Madison to run for the House of Representatives, where he, in turn, beat James Monroe, creating an ironic circle in their early political journeys. Just south of Richmond was another set of neighbors, 17-year-old William Henry Harrison and a newborn John Tyler. Harrison was likely listed under his father's census entry at the Berkeley Plantation, one of the oldest properties in Virginia, while Tyler was living at his prominent family's Greenway Plantation just 8 miles away. Harrison was just beginning his medical studies. His father, Benjamin, was a politician and farmer who also signed the Declaration of Independence. His census entry would also have included the numerous slaves on the property. It is also possible that William was listed under his older brother's census entry in Richmond as he spent time there for his studies in 1790. John Tyler was just 4 months old at the time of the census. His father was a politician and farmer who was a roommate with Thomas Jefferson in college. Other individuals on the plantation included John's mother, 5 siblings, and around 34 of his father's slaves. Up in the state of Massachusetts resided 2 future presidents, John Adams and his oldest son, John Quincy Adams. Massachusetts was the 4th most populous state and the only one to not have any slaves. Vice President Adams was living in Braintree. He called his farmhouse there Peacefield. His census entry showed 3 individuals under his household. This included himself, his wife Abigail, and 1 white male under the age of 16. The most likely candidate for this person would have been his youngest son Thomas, but he was 17 at the time. This may have been a column reporting error, or another explanation is needed for the identity of this person. 23-year-old John Quincy Adams recently became a lawyer and was working out of his father's former Court Street house in the center of Boston. His permanent residence is not certain, and he could not be found in the Boston or Braintree census pages. He was single without children at this time, so he likely was not a head of family and only a number on the census entry for the owner of the place he was residing. In the neighboring state of New York was a 7-year-old Martin Van Buren. He was the first president to be born in the United States of America. He was living with his parents and siblings in the town of Kinderhook, which was in Columbia County and had a census population of just over 4,000 people. His father, Abraham, owned a tavern and inn which often hosted traveling government workers. Despite a modest living, Abraham still owned 6 slaves at the time. The Southwest Territory was land ceded by North Carolina to the federal government just 4 months before the census. Like Virginia, the censuses for this area were also lost or destroyed. One of the residents there was Andrew Jackson, who was living in Nashville. Jackson was a lawyer and was boarding at the house of Rachel Donaldson. She was the widower of John Donaldson, who co-founded the settlement there. Her daughter, Rachel Robards, was also living at the property and was romantically involved with Jackson. Robards was separated from her first husband, but they were still legally married at the time. Jackson also owned at least 1 slave at the time. A young Zachary Taylor was living with his family near the frontier city of Louisville in the District of Kentucky, whose census pages are lost or destroyed as well. His family residence there was named Springfield. Taylor's father, Richard, was a planter who owned a 400-acre farm which enslaved labor helped manage. He was an American Revolution veteran and was the first cousin of James Madison Sr., making Zachary and James Madison Jr. second cousins. The 1800 U.S. Census encompassed all of its states and territories at the time. Its results showed a total population of over 5 million people, of whom about 17% were slaves. 13 current and future presidents were among the population. 3 of them were currently serving in the federal government, whose capital was in the middle of transitioning to Washington, D.C. at the time. 4 were serving at a state and local government level, and the remaining 6 were children or working in the private sector. The 1800 census introduced additional columns for categorizing individuals, but it was essentially the same as the 1790 form. John Adams, now president, continued to reside at his Peacefield home in Massachusetts. His property was now located in Quincy, which branched off from Braintree in 1792. Adams' census entry listed a total of 17 people, including himself and his wife, Abigail. It is uncertain who the other 15 individuals were. His 4 adult children and their families were residing elsewhere but could have been included in his entry. The other individuals could also be a mix of aides, servants, and property caretakers. Adams was in the middle of a bitter re-election campaign against his once close friend, Thomas Jefferson. Over the course of the last decade, their once strong friendship had deteriorated due to increasingly differing political and policy stances. Adams appointed his son, John Quincy Adams, as the minister to Prussia. Therefore, he was living overseas in Berlin. John Quincy spent most of the 1790s abroad, as he also served as the minister to the Netherlands during George Washington's second term. Residing with him was his wife, Louisa Catherine Johnson, who he met and married during a trip to England in 1797. Massachusetts was still John Quincy's home, but the 1800 censuses for Boston were lost or destroyed, and a census entry for him could not be located elsewhere. It is possible that he and his wife were included in his father's totals. The state of New York was now home to 2 future presidents, 17-year-old Martin Van Buren and a newborn Millard Fillmore. Van Buren was still residing with his family in Kinderhook. His father's census entry showed 12 individuals, including 3 slaves. The total count ties into Martin's siblings and parents, but the ages and genders do not match up, so it is unknown who exactly was included in the census entry. Van Buren was now a clerk at the law offices of Peter Sylvester, a former congressman, and he was just beginning to dip his toe into politics, and he leaned towards the Democratic Republic Party. Fillmore was living with his family in what was the town of Milton in Cayuga County. Millard was the second child of Nathaniel and Phoebe Fillmore. They were primarily farmers who recently arrived in the area from Vermont. Nathaniel's census entry shows 4 people which tie into himself, his wife, and his 2 young children. Pennsylvania was home to 9-year-old James Buchanan. He was born in Cove Gap, but by 1800 he and his family were living on a farm in Mercersburg. His father, James Sr., arrived from Ireland in 1783, but was already one of the wealthiest residents in the area via his merchant, farming, and real estate activities. His census entry showed 13 individuals. 7 were immediate family members, and the other 6 were likely workers or more distant relatives. Virginia remained the most populous state in the Union, with nearly 40% of its population being comprised of slaves. 4 future presidents still called Virginia home, but unfortunately, their census records were once again lost or destroyed. Of those 4, only James Monroe changed his residence over the past decade. He moved into his new Highland plantation just 2 miles away from Jefferson's Monticello. Living with him was his wife, and now 2 children. Enslaved labor was still used to maintain and run the new plantation. After being recalled as the minister to France in 1796, he left the federal government and returned home. At the time of the census, He was serving as the governor of Virginia. Jefferson's close ties with the French and disputes with the Federalist Party led to his resignation of Secretary of State in 1793. He re-entered the federal government as the vice president after falling just short to Adams in the 1796 election. At home, Jefferson's daughter Polly married in 1797 and left the plantation. His property still had hundreds of servants and enslaved people, including 2-year-old Beverly Hemmings, the son of the enslaved Sally Hemings. It is widely accepted that Thomas Jefferson and Sally had a hidden relationship and that Beverly was Jefferson's son. Helping Jefferson with his 1800 campaign was James Madison. Madison left Congress in 1796 and by 1800 was a member of the Virginia legislature. While serving in Congress in Philadelphia, Madison met Dolly Payne Todd. Dolly was a recent widow who lost her husband to the yellow fever outbreak in 1793. The two married and both were living on his father's Montpelier plantation. They did not have any biological children together, but Dolly's son from her first marriage, John Payne Todd, was with them as well. John Tyler was now 10 years old. He was still residing with his family at their Greenway plantation. He had 2 additional siblings but lost his mother, Mary, 3 years prior from a stroke. 4-year-old James Knox Polk resided with his family in Pineville, North Carolina, a town situated near the border with South Carolina. James was the oldest child of his parents, Samuel and Jane, who were farmers. Samuel's census entry tied into his family besides one unknown female between 16 and 25 years old. His census also showed that he owned 3 slaves at the time. The Southwest Territory became the state of Tennessee in 1796. Andrew Jackson was residing near Nashville at his new plantation called Hunter's Hill. Jackson served in both chambers of Congress in 1797 before resigning and returning home. He was currently serving as a judge in the Superior Court of Tennessee. He and Rachel were now legally married and living together. He also acquired at least 2 more slaves during the 1790s who would have been on his property as well. The Tennessee census pages were lost or destroyed. Kentucky also became a state in the previous decade. Zachary Taylor was still living with his family near Louisville at their Springfield house. 3 additional Taylors were born, and the family prospered since the last census. By the end of the year, Richard Taylor would own about 10,000 acres and numerous slaves. The Indiana Territory was organized earlier in the year, and its capital, Vincennes, was home to its newly appointed governor, William Henry Harrison. After his father died in 1791, Harrison would quit his medical studies and join the army. His service would take him out west, where he fought in the Northwest Indian War under Major General Anthony Wayne. He served until 1798 and then was elected to become a U.S. congressional delegate for the Northwest Territory before being appointed governor by President Adams in May of 1800. During his military service, he met and married Anna Sims. The couple just had their 3rd child, and William owned numerous slaves that he inherited after his mother's death. Harrison was visiting family in Virginia at the time of the census, so it's possible he was recorded there instead of the Indiana Territory, although both places had their census pages lost or destroyed. The journey of America and its presidents up to the 1950 census will continue to be covered in additional videos, so please check back for the next installment. In the meantime, if you're looking for help with your own research and family tree journey, be sure to check out Family Tree Excel. Family Tree Excel is a collection of macro-enabled Excel workbooks, PDF files, and other spreadsheets that were tailor-made for genealogy purposes. They can be used to build your tree, create charts, reports, and indexes, analyze and summarize sources, and automatically cross-reference files, all while using the vast and powerful features of Microsoft Excel. The Family Tree Excel product collection is continuously expanding, and they are a great complement to any genealogical software or website to help you research, organize, share, and pass down your family tree information. Please check out FamilyTreeExcel.com for more information.